Okay, hi. I'm going to look straight there so I can talk to our live stream friends, but I care about you guys too. Hi, my name is Tamara Winter, and I publish Stripe Press. Can y'all keep a secret? Yeah. Okay, so everybody thinks that Stripe Press was, please don't walk in front of the camera. Everybody thinks that Stripe Press was this like elaborate part of the Collison's plan, or maybe the most elaborate brand marketing play of all time. But the truth is it was kind of an experiment. And so when Stripe Press was born, it was really, Elad's book was kind of the make or break moment. And so it wasn't clear that 5 years ago when we started it, that it would be something people cared about now. It could have been Quibi or CNN Plus. Thank you for that. But I think the fact that High Growth Handbook and Stripe Press now are a thing is really a testament to the fact that Elad really crafted not just a book that's interesting to read, but really a tool that I hope you all find useful. And so I'm excited to host Elad here at Stripe. Thank you all for coming. But I'm also really excited for him to bring Dylan Field. I won't say too much about Dylan. I'll leave that for them. So without further ado, thanks y'all.
Cool. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. We're at Stripe today in South San Francisco, so it's very exciting to be here. And congrats to Stripe on their new office, which is beautiful, by the way. A huge thanks to the Stripe team who helped put this together. So many thanks to Edwin, Tammy, Claire on my side for organizing. And of course, a huge thanks to Dylan for joining.
Thanks for having me here. And this is a beautiful office. Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I don't think people can see it on the live stream, but basically there's sort of these series of steps and like a big sort of atrium style area. So it's a really nice place.
I heard this is the biggest external event that Stripe has had yet, so pretty cool.
Yeah, very exciting. So first off, I'll introduce Dylan. He's, as everybody knows, the CEO and co-founder of Figma. He started the company at age 20, so he dropped out of Brown and did a Teal Fellowship. And I think he was already working on Figma before the Teal Fellowship. We're going to talk about a few different topics, but I think one of the topics that we really want to touch upon, given his experiences as well as education, and what does a modern education look like, and what do the university systems look like, in addition to talking about the history of Figma and sort of his journey. So thanks so much for joining today.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, great. And I should mention one other thing before we dive in. We have a celebrity in the audience. Claire Hughes-Johnson, the CEO of Stripe, is here somewhere. And she has a book coming out on March 7th, which is called Scaling People, and it's all about management and company building. I saw an early preprint of it, and it's fantastic. So, hopefully everybody gets to check that out in about a month or so. So I was just hoping to start a little bit with your founding story. So you took a reasonably unconventional path in terms of, leaving Brown, starting a company. What motivated you to do that? Like, a lot of people don't actually have that courage or conviction to go and do something like that.
Yeah, I was lucky that it was kind of felt obvious because my co-founder, his name's Evan Wallace, was my TA at Brown, and he was the most brilliant person I knew, and I had a chance to do some great internships at that point. Hopefully everyone's okay. Evan was just beyond brilliant. I felt like it was super obvious that I could learn more from Evan than any other context. And so even if the company was like a complete failure, I thought it would be successful for me because I would learn from Evan.
And how did people react to that? Like, when you told your family and friends, and were they supportive? Were they worried about it? Were they concerned?
Well, it was gradual because I applied for the Teal Fellowship, and it was like I think right before New Year's or something like that. And I got the application super last minute. It was half an hour before it was due. My parents thought that it wouldn't actually be done on time. and that it was kind of like this joke, and then they're like, oh, well, you're not going to get it, or as I kept going through rounds of interviews, they're like, well, you're not going to do it, right? And then over time, over time, it basically was like, oh, shoot, you might actually do this. And I see Noor, Noor's not in the audience, never mind, but I thought she was here for a second. There's other people from the Teal Fellowship class I was in that they met in the interview process, because there's like, it went from 40 to 20. And as they met all the people, I think they got a lot more comfortable. But then after we got the fellowship, I called Evan and said, hey, we've got actually funding now, 100,000 over 2 years. Do you want to go do this thing for real? And he was, he's a very reserved guy, and he was quite excited about that.
Did you consider doing other things like YC at the time, or is the Teal Fellowship really the thing that you focused on?
The Teal Fellowship is $100,000 for free. There's no dilution at all. And that was really attractive. YC has some dilution, amazing program otherwise, but I felt like I had somewhat of a network, and the Teal Fellowship could help with more of a network. In retrospect, I do think that the YC is actually pretty helpful for enterprise. I didn't even know what the word enterprise meant at the time, but now I'd probably say, yeah, you should consider YC, because it will help you sell B2B and get some initial customers, whereas I think we had to really work at that. So maybe I should have considered it.
Yeah, I think at the time, I mean, both programs were pretty nascent, right? Like, I don't know what year that was for the Teal Fellowship. Maybe it was a couple years in.
It was the second year, and YC been going since, is it 2008 or something like that?
Yeah, it was 2008.
It was 4 years in for YC. But I remember when I was looking at colleges in the first place, I remember meeting someone who was part of the first YC class, and they're like, "Oh, this is gonna be the new Harvard. Just like don't go to college and go to YC instead." And they're very prescient, I think.
They're pretty accurate, yeah. Because I remember going to early YC demo days, and there was like 10 angels in the audience or 15 angels in the audience. And they had this whole program where they were trying to teach people how to be angel investors just so they could get more angels to invest in startups, because they didn't feel there was enough money to fund people. And so it's interesting to think back to those times when things were actually very scarce in a weird way. What other ideas were you considering besides Figma? And why did you choose that? Because at the time, design, and even today, there's lots of different players in the market. There's lots of different people doing things. Like, how did you choose that idea or area?
Yeah, I think that, and how many people here are founders, just out of curiosity? Oh, cool. It's like half the room. And then how many people are planning to be a founder at some point? Okay, a few others. And how many people like have no intention ever of founding a company? Okay, great. Sorry, this will not be as relevant, but I think like when you're starting a company, it's really useful to ask the question, why now? And this is like pretty cliche for startup stuff, so if you've heard of it already, apologies, but I do think it's a really useful framework. And that question of why now can be societal. Might be there's some like new cultural trend. Perhaps it's regulatory. Some law has been passed or repealed. I like the technological version. And for us, we saw drones in 2012 and WebGL as two technologies that were happening, where because these technologies were happening, new possibilities were suddenly there. And on the drone side, we didn't get very far. Evan in particular was not that interested in doing hardware. He's like, hardware sucks. Run debug cycles are really long, and then we focused on WebGL instead. And in addition to that, we were excited about computational photography for a bit, but quickly realized that with Comphoto, that ends up leading to a consumer sort of application, and the entire purpose of WebGL was to be in the browser. But we're like, why would you do anything photo editing if you're not on the phone? And so we felt like we were kind of building the wrong place, and then eventually sort of shifted our attention to design, which I had been a design intern at Flipboard, and that helped kind of help me realize what could be possible there.
So you basically saw WebGL, and you said this opens up new ways to interact with websites and make them richer in terms of collaboration, interactivity, and things like that. Was there anything you would do differently now, given that looking back on all the success you've had and everything else in terms of those early moments in the why now statement? Or do you think it was pretty accurate in terms of the direction you all were heading in?
I think the why now was like one thing we got really right. The thing that maybe was harder was we had no idea how long it would take, and it ended up taking quite a long time. So I think we believed at the time that it would take maybe a year or two. What ended up taking at least double that time.
You mean to build the first product, or?
Yeah. And I think also we were worried about using the funding that we had attracted. I think it's natural to be conservative, especially in times like these. And I think it's sort of right, but as soon as you have that notion or some sense that there's product market pull, you kind of do have to hit the gas too, which is scary. But I think if we had hired faster and been more willing to build a team quickly, it would have been very helpful and accelerated Figma's pace even further.
What was a moment when you felt that you believed that you had product market fit?
I think, again, it kind of goes to that point of it's really easy to just deny that you have product market fit. I think I didn't admit it to ourselves until literally we had a customer, Microsoft, that told us, hey, you have to start charging for this thing. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to spread it internally. And we really want to spread it internally. And I was like, we might have product market fit. In reality, we'd had it for like a year, you know? And I wish that I had recognized that sooner because I think I would have acted differently. But I think as soon as you start hearing customers just, you know, I remember we got, there's a point when the editor was so slow that if you typed text, you know, it took forever to type the text. We didn't have multiplayer editing yet. There was so much that wasn't there. And a potential customer wrote us a 12-page document saying, here are all the things I want you to go build. And I think, in retrospect, that was like a moment of product market fit, or at least product market pull, where, okay, there's a market there. They're trying to get the product out of us, and it's about how fast can we go do it. And I think now I'd recognize that, but before I didn't.
Yeah, I think that's a really key transition for many companies in terms of pre and post product market fit. And people who've never experienced it think that they have it, even though every sale is a grind and every movement is a grind, and getting people to pay attention is really, really hard. And that's always true, but I think once it starts working, every customer shows up asking for stuff, or you get all this pull, and I think you feel it, and I think the second time you see it, you're like, oh yeah, of course, you know, it's kind of happening. But I think it's really hard to learn the first time around. Are there other things that you felt were like hard things to pick up or hard things to learn?
Management. Apparently Claire's book is coming out soon, so y'all should read it if you haven't been a manager before. I had never managed anyone before Figma. I was an intern, so I didn't know anything. I was like, I think you're supposed to do one-on-ones, so I at least did that. Didn't really know what to talk about during them. But yeah, I mean, it was tough, and I think it was especially tough as we scaled, and I had some personal challenges going on. My dad was dying of cancer at the time, and it was like the emotional burden of that, plus, you know, getting to the point where you've got 10 to 12 reports. That was a really hard moment for the company, and bringing our first manager was very catalytic because it meant that I could go learn from him. And I'm still learning from him today. I consider Sho, our first manager and engineering leader, to be a really great mentor of mine. And I think it's one thing that's kind of cool is you can like recruit your own mentors to the company.
Yeah, I know that Bill Gates was notorious for doing that, where he'd hire a COO, and then every 18 to 36 months, he'd replace that person as the company would scale, and then he'd learn off of that new person and then replace them with the next person. And so to your point, he almost had this like staggered, you know, COO chain that of people left behind, I guess.
In this case, Sho is still here like 7 years later.
Yeah, no, I wasn't. Maybe you should reconsider, you know, the Shro thing, but all right. So something we could talk about a few opportunities. You mentioned why now statements and things that are in transition or interesting areas. Are there specific areas you think are most interesting right now in terms of opportunities? Is it climate? Is it biotech? Is it ed tech? Is it other things?
I think there's so much that's interesting. I think that, yeah, I have a hard time like directing people to one thing, because I think that the nature of entrepreneurship is that, like, I hope y'all will tell me afterwards what's really cool, and probably everybody here has a different point of view on that. I do think people move in herds a lot, and so like right now, everyone's excited about AI, for example, and that's great. Like, there's gonna be some awesome stuff that comes out of that. There's also gonna be like other things that come out that are other places, and probably some of the really big companies will have some sprinkles of AI, but like are actually in a completely different realm entirely. And if you start with AI, you're not gonna find them. And so I think just try to have that independent thought, look at different areas that you think are interesting. One other thing I'll say, since a lot of people here are entrepreneurs, is that there are actually like a lot of good ideas out there. It's kind of the weird part, especially just searching for one. It feels like it's not the case, but there's so many different markets that are underserved. And I think that the more important thing actually is to find something that you are personally passionate about. because basically any good company takes a long time to build. And if you are, let's say, 3 to 4 years in on an idea that you hate, you're just going to burn out and you're going to quit, or maybe you'll have like a zombie company, and you'll be able to attract some customers and some revenue, but it won't feel good, and you'll be like hating life. And I've seen this with a few friends. Like it's real, and I would just say, don't just go for an idea because it's kind of working. Go for an idea that you really care about, because even if it doesn't work, you'll still learn from it and you'll still have fun.
Yeah, I think we're also moving back into a period where there won't be capital to keep things going forever, and so you really have to do something if you care about it in some sense, or at least you're desperate for it to exist. So you were very early to various areas of crypto, and one of the things you became known for was being an NFT collector. Can you tell us more about how you got into NFTs and how you view the market now and how you think about the art that is involved?
Sure. It's funny because I thought I was late to crypto, but now apparently I'm early, so I'll take it. I was really interested in cryptography in high school, and I had put a talk out somewhere on hash functions, and I started getting these emails in like 2009 from these weird people talking about this Bitcoin thing, and I was like, ugh, this crazy internet people with their internet money, magical money, like weird stuff. Just dismissed it all. And then I joined the Teal Fellowship. And in the Teal Fellowship, a lot of people were very excited about Bitcoin very early on. And it was during one of the early price bubbles, I think 2013. And it kind of like went up to $1,000 and then crashed. And I'm like, it serves them right. They shouldn't have wasted their money on that. But then eventually, kind of with Ethereum, started getting more interested and was like, this is really cool technically. My wife, Elena, started getting very interested in the events around Ethereum, and ultimately started a company called Ironfish. And we started talking sort of winter 2017, 2018 about crypto collectibles. And I was obsessed with CryptoPunks at the time. We didn't really have a word NFT yet. We called them crypto collectibles. But I think like this idea that there could be items that were digital fascinated me. Partially because like I was a kid who liked Pokemon cards and stuff, but also partially because I really like Neopets. Anyone play Neopets out here? There's several of us. And Neopets was like a really cool virtual pets website that had Flash games, but the more important part was it had an entire virtual economy. And so I think I had this mental model from having played Neopets of what that would look like. And it literally felt the exact same, like as Ethereum and NFTs took off. But yeah, I think that it's kind of a bummer because as NFTs did take off, a lot of scammers came in. As money came into it, the system, it attracted really bad behavior as well. And so I think that I definitely have like a more formal definition of collectible markets now. And art is collectible, so I'm not making a distinction of like it's all collectibles. I think there is some art, but at the same time, I think you have to be cautious of any market where as money comes into the market, prices go up, and as it goes out, prices go down, which describes a lot of marketplaces, but like you do want something of fundamental value. And I think that you can argue that crypto with hash power and whatnot has some fundamental value, trading activity, whatnot, but collectibles it's a little bit harder. And so I think you have to buy things if you're going to participate in that market, you have to buy things that you're going to want to keep forever. Basically, I've only sold like 2 NFTs in my life.
What do you think are other interesting areas of crypto right now, or big unsolved problems?
I think privacy is really important. My wife is working on this, so I'm a little biased. I don't speak for her, but I think that it's a big security risk for people to hold crypto right now, unfortunately, and it's important that we get to a place where crypto is a bit more like actual physical cash, in that I can be able to give you crypto, and that's not something that's going to be traced. At the same time, you want to do that in a compliant way. You want to make sure that North Korea is not laundering $1 billion through crypto. And so finding the sort of intersection of that I think is a really interesting and important research problem. But I do think that we need to find more privacy. Scalability is really starting to take off, which is awesome to see. I remember in the early days of Ethereum, it was like, what will make Ethereum work? And it was, we're talking about stability and scalability. And it's like both those check marks might be there. I think the third thing that's needed right now desperately is regulation. And I didn't expect to be like talking about how we need regulation for crypto. especially given that crypto was such a libertarian idea. But I think that actually the lack of regulation right now is blocking crypto. And it's super important that the United States in particular is more crisp about what they expect from crypto companies. If we don't do that, we're going to lose the market, and it's all going to go overseas. And there's such an opportunity for the United States to be like the home of crypto right now. So I really hope that the U.S. regulators get on that.
I guess another big trend that, to your point, a lot of people are looking at right now is AI and generative AI and other areas of AI. How are you thinking about it outside of Figma in terms of like the big changes that are coming due to this new technology?
So much, and inside of Figma too. I mean, like Ankur's here, and he's exploring. Ankur's over there in the corner. We're exploring a lot around, what it can mean for Figma and for designers, and how can we make it so that designers are able to collaborate with AI better. But I think that outside of Figma, there's basically every industry probably will be touched by this, and I think it's super interesting the pace at which this is happening. I mean, gosh, like, even over the last 3 months, the number of papers that are coming out in different new fields using some of these models and ideas is staggering. And I just think it's a completely new tooling method. And even if we just pause it at the current technology we're at today, which obviously is not the case, that's already world-changing for like pretty much every single segment of every market.
Are you somebody who views AI as like tooling or something that will eventually lead to AGI, or both?
Well, I definitely think it could be both. I think AGI is difficult to define, so let's just go with like, I think that AI will make fundamental research contributions, for example. Like I think people are always chicken to give like a prediction, so I'll put one out there. I think like by 2030 or at least 2033, there will be a AI co-author of a paper for like a pure math research journal, and that will, and if it's not co-author, there should have been an AI co-author in terms of it's not getting enough credit, basically. So where is the difference between tooling and AGI start and end? Like if you talk to a chatbot, is that a tool, or if it has sentience or some ability to remember like some state? When does it become AGI? I think these are really difficult questions to answer. But I think that, I was listening to someone speak this the other day. I think maybe it was Balaji, and he was saying like, there's the multiplayer AI problem. How do you make it so that you're able to convince people in a multiplayer way that if there's many agents and many humans, which ones are the AIs and which ones are the humans? And if the AIs can fool the humans and make them think that they're humans, like that's kind of like the new version of the Turing test. If it gets to that level, like, is that AGI? I don't know.
That's already happened too. So if you look at Cicero, which Facebook trained to play diplomacy, which is a game where you have a bunch of people interacting, in this case over text, you had a bot that was basically convincing people that it was a person, and based on that, it was manipulating them in the game. Yep. And it won the
winning
game,
too.
Right? Yeah, and it was winning. And so that was, a lot of people view that as kind of the last frontier on the gaming side of AI-based developments.
Yeah, I really want Civ, but with that tech. So if anyone's looking for an idea, that's one. I will be your customer. and Figma might really be harmed by it, but.
On a related question, since you care a lot about education and we thought a lot about it, how do you think AI will impact education? I mean, the canonical or the really early book on it was The Diamond Age and the Young Girls Illustrated Primer, and there's been a lot written, at least in sci-fi, around how AI will help people learn at their own pace and sort of train humanity at scale. What are your views on the impact it'll have, when it will have it, how it'll have it, how that will change things?
Yeah, Diamond Age is amazing. So if you haven't read it yet, definitely check it out. It's one of those books where it's like the early chapters, you turn a page, and every new page has some like crazy invention you've never heard of before or thought of, and it's just wild. But I think that the AI tutors will certainly be a thing. I think AI therapists will also be a thing, by the way. That's another idea that I want someone to build. But make it local, not cloud-based, please. Otherwise, make everything cloud-based, but not the therapist. But I think that AI tutors is a really exciting idea. It's really fascinating right now to read some of the college newspapers out there. They're all super scared of ChatGPT. What does this mean? Is everyone going to cheat? And it's like, no, I think this could help people learn. Sure, they could put their work into this and have them generate a paper, but if they're doing that, like, isn't that a bigger issue? They could already like hire someone online to go write a paper, right?
Yeah, the state of New York, by the way, banned the use of ChatGPT in its schools, which means every person in high school now uses it, instantly overnight. So it's like the perfect marketing message for OpenAI.
But yeah, I mean, I think that ChatGPT is obviously an early example. I think there's going to be much better models in the future that hopefully will not just like hallucinate information. They'll be more accurate, and they'll remember more about you. They'll be able to, lots of things that'll be different. But I think it could be a very useful tool. It's like a professor that you can go to office hours for any time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like it's a very natural add-on to a lot of the online courseware that's emerging now from both Stanford, MIT, but also things like Khan Academy or others. And so, I hope that sometime this year we'll start to see some interesting things there in terms of AI-based tutor. Do you think that in certain parts of the world it'll eventually just subsume the education system, or do you think it's a complement forever? Or 10 years from now, to your point on, perhaps we have AIs that are smart enough to actually contribute to high-level mathematics, and I actually think that could be sooner. I know, 2 companies working on that, for example.
Except for that after. I think, yeah, looking ahead, first of all, what is the education system? I think the education system is a lot of things packaged into one, and it's kind of a bundle right now. So, if you're going to a university in physical meet space, like it's definitely a sort of meeting system, right? Yeah, nothing against that. Like I met Evan, my co-founder at university, right? It's not to be sexual. I think it's obviously a credentialing system. There's the whole learning thing too. But I think the physical community part matters quite a bit. I think it's also a social club. You get into this university and then you're kind of like part of the social club for life. They try to like involve you in alumni stuff. And I think that there's a book, The Case Against Education, which if you're interested in this topic is worth reading, kind of unpacks this more. But one of the things that it says is on the topic of degrees is if you finish, call it 7 semesters out of 8, you should have the same effective market value in the labor market as if you finish 8, but you don't. And so I think it's also signaling your agreeableness, your conscientiousness, and how willing are you going to go with a program. It is also a training ground for academia, right? It's kind of a funnel. Most people drop off, but some of them make it through to like a master's or PhD and then become professors and kind of join the cult, right? And I don't say a cult in a pejorative way. I say it in like just recognizing that it's like it has its own values, it has its own social mores and whatnot, and culture and point of view on a lot of different issues. So yeah, I think that as you have AI come to being more, the credentialing part of that all gets messed up, and sort of the funnel into academia probably gets messed up, and the social club part probably increases in value, but the maybe credentialing part decreases in value, and I think it will start to make people question, okay, what was the credential good for in the first place? So I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it seems like media kind of went through something similar, actually, where the internet was a big disruptive force for it, and really it meant that certain big brands survived, the New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, and sort of the mid-tier or the mid-tier news outlets were the ones that really got impacted in terms of business model and traffic and everything else. And so do you think the same thing happens in the university system where value continues to aggregate to the big brands, or do you think those brands are also subsumed by this change?
That's my suspicion. I really hope that we get to the world where there are universities out there that you can just completely go to online. They're better than YouTube in terms of like YouTube is, I think it's hard for me to learn on YouTube for the most part. Like I can go through a few videos, but the discipline of a course structure that I'm signing up for, I'm getting good feedback all the time. I can talk to somebody about questions as they arise. I think that YouTube is kind of lacking there, but also like doesn't require the physical presence of universities, so you can be wherever you need to be and still work towards learning a set of material. I think we could get there, and you could have a scalable online system around that. There's kind of like a cartel around the credentialing of universities in the first place, But assuming you sort of sort through that in the United States, or perhaps it's abroad, then you have to get to the point where it's like recognizing market value, and that employers, I guess, is fine. Because I think there's kind of like a social reset that needs to happen there. And then I think you get like a lot of the lower tier universities wiped out by that, which will be sad because I think a lot of them contain some very good teachers, but probably not a lot of good, like not a ton of research is happening in those places. And perhaps like you have think tanks and whatnot spring up to take the place for the researchers. And then from there, you know, the ones that are left are like you described. It's these ones that have had a lot more reputation.
And do you think those just become like primary for credentialing and then a little bit of research, but the rest gets disaggregated across sort of the middle tier, it sounds like?
Yeah, I think that something like that, but there's also a social club aspect, and I think that like it's not like it's a real thing, and it's not a bad thing.
Yeah. So when you left Brown, what was your social club? Was it other founders? Was it Teal Fellows? Was it something else?
Basically, I also the people I work with at Flipboard. There's like Stanford kids nearby. Ross, he was definitely part of it. I was like, "Yo, you're working on cool stuff. Let's hang out." And
Ross is sitting there in the audience.
Yeah, I saw him, so I'm like all excited. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, but that was I think the biggest thing in addition to money the Teal Fellowship offered was community, and I think a learning community, whether it's in the physical sense of a university or it's you know, the Silicon Valley has been great. Historically, maybe it's coming back. I hope we have a lot of Silicon Valleys around the world that you can move to that are sort of all these different hubs around the world that are close to you and have that infrastructure.
How would you encourage people to find community today? So say that you're either a teenager and you're, you know, either going to college or not, but you're thinking about how do I plug into people who are like me? Like, how would you approach that? And then relatedly, if you were to move to a specific geography, where would you go and why, and how would you find your tribe?
I would, you know, first of all, I think that a lot of people are limited by geography. And so I would say that given that if you're just trying to connect with people virtually, don't ignore the power of a cold email. It's amazing how many people will respond to a cold email when you write it, especially if it's well written and has like a clear point of view or a clear question. If you're just like, hey, let's hang out for a half hour, it'll be harder to get their attention. But if you have like a very specific question, people do reply. And so I think that you could start to build relationships there. Finding out where the community lives online is really important. You know, in the past, I think that it was Twitter. I think it's sort of fading at this point. And a lot of communities are finding their own niches that are outside Twitter. I worry a lot of them are going private now, and it's going to be less accessible for people. Probably better for the community and their health, and probably not as many like flame wars and stuff, but like harder to break into. But I think find out where it is, break into that community online, and hang out, and just like learn the norms, learn the language, and then start to find out ways to be helpful to people.
Yeah, I found that just doing something useful for a community inserts you into it almost instantly. And so it's like if you see an open source project and you contribute in a small way, or you know you just help organize something, often that really helps. How do you think about credentialing? Like, who's going to actually provide the credentials of the future besides the universities then? And it feels like there's different types of credentials. Like you mentioned, YC is almost like the new Harvard or something. So that's like a business credential or a startup credential. Are there different types of credentials in your mind? And do you know who will give them out?
I don't know exactly where we end up there. I hope that people put less sort of weight on credentials over time. I think that that's a real way to create equity, is to put less weight in credentials. But I think, yeah, time will tell. But I think that the first thing that you all can do if you're founders is to not require credentials for your company.
And I guess in the context of the Teal Fellowship, you know, could you describe a little bit more about your experiences there, what you thought you got out of it? And then, you know, maybe we can follow up with some questions around, are there other programs that feel similar in terms of what they do?
Yeah, the Teal Fellowship was awesome. I haven't found similar programs yet that kind of like find the world's, you know, most ambitious young people. Mm-hmm. I think there's something to that sort of gauntlet of dropping out that works for the Teal Fellowship. And, you know, it's interesting. I've been part of sort of selecting new classes for a while too, and we have a lot of applicants, but when you kind of narrow it all the way down, it's actually sometimes hard to fill a class. And there's very few people that are both don't have, you know, they're risk on. They're willing to take that risk. They don't need to have the credential right away, and also they're have an idea right then, and they have the permission that they've granted themselves permission to do it. I think so many people just like can't get in their heads that you have permission to go do whatever you want to do. And as soon as you kind of have that unlock, it's so powerful. But I think that's another thing that we have to find a way to give people en masse. And the more people that can have that, the better. So.
Yeah, I feel like there's other programs that help identify at least extremely smart and driven people around the world. So for example, the IIT university system in India, I think, is a great example of a system where anybody can take a standardized test and then a subset of people get in, and it's extremely selective. And so that the median person in there is quite exceptional in all sorts of ways. And so sometimes I wonder, like, what are other ways at scale to identify and nurture the people who can really help drive the future in certain ways?
Yeah, I remember when I was applying to Brown, or got into Brown, I started to talk with someone who was coming from an IIT prep environment, and he was also going to Brown. He sent me the questions that they were reviewing, and I was like, I can't answer any of these. Like,
yeah.
I felt really dumb.
Yeah, you also get local recognition. So a friend of mine was a gold medalist at IIT, and the town he was in did a literal parade with him, and it was very strong recognition. He was in a lot of the papers, and so it's interesting to think about the societal cues you can give to actually reward people who can be exceptional over time. What do you think in general about things like, there's a lot of debate societally around standardized testing or merit-based testing, and do those work or not? Do you have any opinions on that? Or
I have a lot of opinions. I probably diverge a bit from like Silicon Valley consensus here. I think maybe the understated Silicon Valley consensus that doesn't get out there as much as like IQ is real and standardized testing is correlated with it. So that's a straw man that I'm arguing against. I think that actually you can probably, if you have access to tutoring and you have access to resources, you can improve your score like a lot more than people think on that SAT. So I actually am more aligned with some of the equity arguments that universities make there than I think a lot of folks are. But at the same time, I do think that just having no way to differentiate yourself other than grades or extracurriculars that are kind of like easy to forge is not quite the right method either. So yeah, it's a pretty hard problem. I don't know how to solve that.
I guess the last sort of prepared question I have, and then we go to a mix of questions that people asked on both Dory as well as the forum, as well as we'll go to a few live questions in the audience. We'll kind of alternate, is just around longer term life goals. So you've had an amazing run, right? I think you're 30, 31.
Still running.
Yeah, you're still running. Yeah, I don't mean like anything's over. I'm just saying you've accomplished a lot. I should say as an aside, by the way, and all this topic of dropping out of school and things like that, I feel like people who have dropped out of school successfully, and there's lots of people who've dropped out of school unsuccessfully, right? But people who've dropped out of school successfully get another, especially if they start a company, they get like an extra 8 years or something to their time in tech. Because you lose a couple years in terms of schooling, and then you lose a couple years in terms of your first job. And so you gain like an extra generation in the technology ecosystem, which is a long time, right? Like 6 or 8 years ago, I can't even think back to what that was, right? That was like Uber was kind of really ramping. And
On-demand everything.
Yeah, on-demand everything was happening.
You can get your laundry on demand. You can get your groceries on demand.
Yeah.
You can get a car on demand. You can walk your dog on demand. It was, and also all subsidized by VC. Thank you. Yeah. Wish those days were back.
Yeah. So it was a very different era. And so you see like an extra generation, and you have all this extra time. And I sometimes wish I could go back in time and like drop out myself and just, because I did a PhD, so I'm even worse. I like stuck around extra. I actually took some night classes at Stanford and dropped out just so I could say I was a Stanford dropout with the hope that will increase my allure.
I think I'm actually going back to school and taking a math class right now.
Okay.
So
well, there goes that.
that.
School is good. So, my main question, that was a long-winded way of asking. When I look at people who've had great success and yet are still running, they often start to do really interesting other things. So for example, Patrick and John Collins, the founders of Stripe, have set up this institute called ARC alongside other folks on the biology side. Silvana Koneman and a few other folks are driving it as well in concert with them. Or, Brian Armstrong started a longevity company that he's involved with, or Zuck has CZI. And so I'm just sort of curious, like, how you think about the other areas of science or technology or the future that you kind of want to help contribute to over time?
I mean, 3 examples you gave were like bio and healthcare, so I guess that's the theme. But not, I mean, I think first of all, I'm like super just focused on Figma right now, and there's so much we can do still, and I think it's such a big leverage point, and so I feel very, very grateful to be working on that, and also to work with the amazing team that we have. But yeah, I mean, I think like areas that are maybe underserved that are not exactly capitalist. One is maybe data visualization. I think that there's different media outlets that try to do data visualization right now, but I think that there's probably an opportunity to bring people together to data visualization more, and that's something that'd be cool to explore someday. But I don't feel like I have to do that urgently. I feel more urgent about all the Figma things.
Okay, great. Well, I was hoping we could open up to questions of the audience and maybe alternate between a question from the audience and then a question that the audience asked a bit more discreetly. So I don't know if anybody wants to go first, or I can kick off a question while we're, yeah, please. Oh, sorry, just wait for the microphone, please. Yeah.
So you mentioned, is this on? Okay, perfect. I guess like when you were going through your journey of trying to get to the point of founding Figma, you mentioned, the why now is important and, what's going on in the world, but then also, it being of meaningful substance, so that way you don't burn out and kind of continue through it. I find this phase to be pretty illegible for most people. It's really hard to be able to kind of like go from, one kind of idea to the next and figure out it ultimately, where that intersection lies. You mentioned starting off with drones and then, got yourself to Figma, but what was that journey like more concretely, and how you kind of like found the thing that you ultimately love to do, but at the same time, like created real value for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we didn't consider ideas that we were not interested in working on, so that was a good prior. And for Evan, he didn't want to work on drones. He's like, I already built drones. I don't want to build more drones. And he especially didn't want to go into defense, which we thought was a potential place that you might get pulled into. For WebGL, we were very interested in all sorts of graphics tools, but the first one we actually built was a 2D to 3D scene converter. So basically, you could take an image, annotate it, and it would transform into a 3D scene. And you could then kind of like place furniture or try to like move objects around. It was pretty neat for 2012, and all in the browser. And at the same time, we're like, what would we use this for? And maybe now you'd be like metaverse, but at the time, it felt like it was kind of like maybe you could make like a better Craigslist housing section or something. That just sounded not interesting, so we didn't go in that. And then we built like a face swap app, and it's kind of like a toy, really fun to use. I would show my friends and like investors we met with, oh, here's your face, it's swapped. And like that didn't, exist in an easy way then. I think Snapchat kind of did it later, but it was a few years later. But like, it was a one-off, and while it was fun to use, fun to make, it didn't work systematically with everything else. And I think that kind of as we iterated through different things we built, and we really did explore through building. One thing that we did was photo editing, and we built it in the browser. It was very consumer. It wasn't very professional, but I think had some interesting ideas in it. And it was this thing where we kind of like, after we built a lot of it, we took a step back and we looked at the trends, and probably should have started there, but it was like, okay, what's the average megapixels per like iPhone? And it was just going up, concave up, and then what are the number of digital cameras sold per year? And it's like concave down, and it's like, oh, this is the same trend. Like the best camera is the one you have in your pocket, which is the old photographer adage. And so, okay, maybe this is not the thing we should go into, and we scrapped that and started talking to all these designers and realized that wait, fireworks was just killed off, and there's a big hole in the market for product design. We didn't have the word product design. We didn't know why design was evolving and growing so much. But I think looking back, it was that the cloud was taking off, developer tooling was getting better, and there's less cost going to development. And so more costs were going to design. That's where you differentiate your product. And so more resources started getting pulled into design. And from 2012 when we started, IBM had like one designer to every 72 engineers. 5 years later, it was 1 to 8. And so there's this massive growth that we're starting to see the very earliest hint of. And we just kind of charged at and started working on that. I think once we started on that journey, it just kind of like, there's always more to do, and we kept going for it. And so even then, in the early days, it felt like we had that pull. I don't know if that helps, but it's the more expanded version.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And would you find that, like, I guess when you got into it and you started, going down this path, was it then that you kind of started saying, like, yeah, this is something that I enjoy, and this is something that I can, like, I guess, like, look forward to the future through this experience, that this is something that I would want to, say, dedicate the next 10 years to? Because I've heard, some people kind of, like, try to figure this out beforehand or, some way or another, but was that kind of, like, what you ended up finding out?
I think we knew, like, days into working on any project, like, whether we wanted to work on it or not. So, example where we didn't feel that way, I had a moment where I tried to convince Evan to build a meme generator, and, we built it, over the course of, like, 3 days, because meme generators are, like, not that hard to build. And this was maybe fall 2012, and it was like, memes are going to be huge on the internet, and, like, meme generator websites are going to have a lot of traffic, and it's like, I wasn't wrong, but we were a week into it, and, I'm kind of going, fuck, I dropped out for this, and Evan's going, I think I'm going to quit if we keep working on this, and, it was very obvious right away that was not something we wanted to work on, so.
Yeah, it's definitely gone both ways. Like, I've seen a lot of people start companies, and the momentum of the company keeps them excited versus the specific product. And I think different people are motivated by different things. I'll go to a quick question that was input, and then we can go to another question from the audience. This is something somebody input in a Dory. Dylan has said many times that the Brett Victor talk, Inventing on Principle, had a big impact on him and was the reason why he started Figma. The most important part of the talk being that if you can make a shorter loop between inputs and outputs in a creative setting, it can help unlock and improve the creative process. I'm curious what Dylan thinks of how everything that's happening with generative AI will have an impact on creativity and the notion of further reducing the barriers to creativity by creating a closer relationship between inputs and outputs. It's pretty long.
So there's a lot to that question. If
like
you
a
asked
Russian
it, feel
novel.
free to meet me later. I'm intrigued. I think it's super cool to think about generative AI in that sense of, like, how do you get to results faster, but also maybe the missing factor that people are not paying much attention to yet is BCI, and I think probably because BCI, if it's not invasive, is not super useful yet.
By BCI, you mean brain-computer interface,
Yep,
right? Yeah.
exactly. But I think as we get sort of more signals and more degrees of freedom from BCI over time, you could imagine a great feedback loop going where you're able to kind of nudge a model in different ways, and maybe that's an input that's in addition to a prompt or something like that. I think that'd be really fun to explore. Imagine being, like, in a device and you have this real-time feedback loop going. I think that would really get to some of the ideas that Brett Victor is mentioning. Although Brett Victor, I'd be curious what he would say about that. He might not like it.
Cool. We'll take another question from the audience, maybe up there in the corner.
What is the youngest viable age for Teal Fellow, in your opinion, and why?
Oh, man. I think we've interviewed people that are quite young. Laura Deming, I think she was 16 or 17 when she got the fellowship. And she's gone on, she went out and, studied for maybe a year while trying to raise money, and eventually pulled it off. And she raised a first fund. It's had historic returns, and she's raised follow-on funds as well. And it's pretty incredible what she did. Speaking of generations, for like a biotech fund, that's probably 3 generations it would take you to get to that point. And so she's kind of like, did a speed run and did it at 17, 16. So yeah, I think if you have rigorous training, which Laura did, then you could do it that young, 16, 17. I think most people don't have that training that young. She had already been, a few years at MIT. She had been homeschooled. She worked at a biolab with Cynthia Kenyon, I think. And so I think that, you probably want to start even earlier than that. and figure out, okay, what are the things that the life experiences I need and the sort of academic training I need in order to get to the point where I could start something that young. And then, we can separately debate the trade-offs that you're making with your life of starting that young. But you asked the question, so I'm trying to answer it.
Cool. Another question on Dory was Figma was highly successful at moving design into the browser, while some other industry productivity apps like music, mechanical engineering, et cetera, are mostly native. Do you expect that to change, and what's blocking the switch?
I think that basically like all software will be browser-based and collaborative. So yeah, I just have a thesis there. If you're building something cool, let me know.
What do you think slowed it down?
I think it's hard, and I think some of the stuff is, either has network effects or switching costs. I think it's best when you can find things that are not just going to be you're going to put them in the browser and make them collaborative, and that's it. You have some other things that you're also doing, and if you can find like additional differentiators on top of that, that's when I think it really shines.
Okay. Another question
also,
from the audience.
one more thought is collaborative workflows really help as the collaboration part.
Maybe up there in the far back on the stairs.
You mentioned IIT students earlier, and I was curious what you think the difference between students coming out of IIT and Stanford is, and like if there is a gap, and like what drives it if there is a gap.
Well, I'd actually mentioned IIT, so I'm going to give him that question.
I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, I haven't tried to assess some difference between Stanford and IIT. I think in both cases you have really smart people who have been selected across different criteria to attend. And I think it really depends on the university in terms of what those criteria are. IIT's traditionally just been like a giant test, effectively, right? While Stanford and I think a lot of the different sort of top universities in the US have more mixed criteria, and that criteria may include things like legacy, right? Did somebody's parents go there or grandparents go there? And some of those systems seem a little bit odd to me in terms of why is it a hereditary thing, that you get to keep going to a certain school or something. If you think about it, that's a little bit odd. I've never done the full survey or the comparison or whatever. I do think that you can compare within US-based universities and ask, why are so many startup founders out of Stanford but not out of X other top university? And part of that is probably like a geolocation issue. It may be other things. And also students, I think, self-select into certain pools based on what those pools lead into if they're very motivated to be in that pool. And so I think one of the interesting things to think about is where do all the little clusters of the best people in a given field come from, and why do they all seem to come from the same places? Like, why do so many great finance people come from Penn and Wharton, while so many great founders come out of Stanford or whatever it may be? And so I think that's kind of different from what you're asking, but I think an interesting question. Cool. Maybe we can take a question right there.
Hey Dylan, thanks for coming, and thanks Elad and Cynthia for hosting the event. I had a question around product. So you mentioned that once you get product market fit, you inevitably get a lot of product feedback and feature requests. So I was wondering, what's your framework to sort of separate the noise from the signal for figuring out what to build and what to take seriously and what to just ignore?
Yeah, I'm happy to give a general answer, although obviously there's a bit of an art to it, and the specificity matters quite a bit, and also the type of product you're building matters. So like, let's say you're doing something consumer, you probably want to like figure out how to make it as simple as possible. And so just like doing everything that people come up with is probably a bad idea, even if you can. But in the context of Figma, where we're building something that there's more of a particular target user, a designer, and yes, there's like other people that use it around the designer, and so we want to keep it not super complex, but at the same time we have that persona in mind. The obvious one is like effort versus impact, and so you can kind of like plot out, if x-axis is effort, y-axis is impact, what are the different features you can build. Obviously if you find something that's like super low effort, super high impact, like probably go do it. And then at the same time though, I think you have to have your sort of like long-term product framework in mind, and think about how sort of the roadmap will evolve over the next few years, how you imagine things changing, how you're going to keep things simple. one motto that I love a lot is like keep the simple things simple, but make the complex things possible. And I think that the more you can do that, the better your product will be, and the more it'll be loved. I think that there's some things where no one will ask for them, but they're really important. So, for example, multiplayer for Figma was one of those. We had maybe like one person or two people ask for it out of like hundreds we had talked to, because most people weren't working at the same computer at the same time. I done my internship at Flipboard, and it helped me have a sense that it could be important. Evan and I had both done a lot of like playing around with Google Wave, which was a thing at some point for a brief moment. But I think we both had this like sort of conviction around collaboration, multiplayer editing. But most designers we asked, hey, do you want to do this activity with in the browser in real time? And they're like, no, I have no interest in that at all. But nevertheless, we started building Figma, realized, okay, if it's last edit wins and we're both in the tab at the same time and you make an edit and my thing reloads and I make an edit, your thing reloads, it just sucks. And so clearly we need to do this thing. And we went all in on it, and it took like 9 months to go build. And so I think that when you kind of have those insights, even if no one's asking for them, you have to prioritize them sometimes. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention tech debt. If you're not constantly addressing tech debt, I think it'll hurt later. At the same time, if you address tech debt so much that you're not building, like you basically have a dead product. And so that doesn't work either. So you have to find the right balance between all these things.
I'll do one last question from here, and then we'll keep it the audience from here on out. What is an experience where the company was at its highest risk, and how did you overcome it, and what did you learn from it?
It was basically what I mentioned earlier, where we were maybe 12 people, and I was going through a lot of family stuff with my dad, and at some point, folks took me aside, and they were kind enough to not invite the newer hires into the room, but it was like you meet 2/3 of the team, if not more. So maybe it's like 9 people or so at that point, and they said, "Hey, we think you need some help." And that was a pretty intense moment. I took a few days and was away from the office, but we ultimately did hire our director of engineering then. Now he's a VP product at Figma, I also just like took a moment to reset my relationships, and some of the people that were in that room ended up leaving. Some of them stayed at the company, but I think it was also a bit of a cultural reset moment, not just for me but for the greater team as we went up to launch, because we weren't launched yet either. It was like we had done so much work and had been going for so long, and to have not launched, I think people were really frustrated, and rightfully so. So it's hard. I think one thing I'll just leave everybody with, if you're founders and you're working and going through challenges like this, like don't feel shame over them. Talk to other people about them, and you'll be surprised at like the amount of help they can give you. I think that peer groups and people that you can chat with are super important. And it turns out that like there's all these challenges that are out there that people have been through before, and almost nothing is unique to your own situation, even though it seems like it is at the time. And so just highly encourage that.
Question right there in the middle. If it's possible to get to that person. Okay.
Thank you. Dylan, when you were speaking about the Teal Fellowship, about education, you mentioned this notion of giving yourself the permission to do anything, to know that you can do anything. And I think you allude to notions of like disagreeableness, nonconformity as important traits for being a Teal Fellow, being a founder. Do you think those traits are kind of, are they nature or nurture? Can they be developed? And for yourself, how did you develop those traits or discover that you had them in capacities above the average person?
That's a really interesting question. I think I would say that disagreeableness, I would unpack that a bit more, because I think that you can be agreeable and be a founder. I think I'm a pretty agreeable person. I don't know. What do you think?
Sure.
I'll do a survey of my team later. But no, I think you can be agreeable. You can like have that pleaser gene and also still go out and like want to do stuff. I mean, look at any sales-led company, for example. Like most salespeople like to make other people happy, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't really enjoy their job, unless it's like more of a competitive thing. They want to like win something over on them, and then that happens. But I think that I think that actually you can be agreeable. I think on the nonconformist part, you have to have an insight that's nonconformist. Doesn't mean you have to be like, nonconformist in every single way in your life. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's nature, but instead I would say it's more about like training your brain to think in these ways. And then if you are a very agreeable person, you still have to be direct with your feedback to people. Otherwise, you're going to have a terrible company culture. And so you have to get to the point where you're willing to like have those direct conversations and be really clear with your team about like, here's where we're going. Here's what, if something needs to change, here's what needs to change in order to like make sure that everyone's going the same way. What would you add? Or would you disagree or agree?
I think ultimately it depends on how you define disagreeable. And it's funny, I was on a long text thread with a group of people about this a few days ago, literally this topic of disagreeableness and what does it really mean. And there's disagreeable and you pull that into your interactions with others and then you're kind of a jerk. And there's disagreeable in terms of thinking for yourself, thinking bottom up, making your own choices, doing unpopular things. And that's a different form of disagreeableness. And some people have both, and some people just have one of those in either direction, right? And so I think the important thing is being willing to make your own decisions. And I think part of that is making your own decision and dropping out of school and starting a company like Dylan did. I think part of that, and I think this is where I'd sort of consider a lot of sort of failed leadership of the last few years in tech, has been that too many people have viewed leadership as popularity instead of leadership. And so they say, well, if all my employees want something, that's probably the right thing to do. And it isn't always, right? It's kind of like a coach on a team. If all your players on your team is saying something, maybe they don't want to run that extra sprint, but they should, right? And so I would separate out those things. And I think because in many people's minds, those two things are the same concept, it really hurts people's willingness to do certain things that are bold because they're worried about also being a jerk when they don't realize it's just being bold or being a good leader or taking a stand or doing what they think is right. So, last question. Oh, right there, please.
Can I ask a question? I wanted to ask you about generative AI in design and what you think would be, some of the most impressive features that generative AI could bring, and specifically, do you think there'd be add-ons or features in the current flow of design, or something that would be radically different in kind of the workflow of how people do design?
Yeah, I mean, it's not generative AI, but actually it's, I'm very excited about like what does Copilot mean for design, and I think that there's a chance to really make it so that designers can explore new options and think through new possibilities and do that in an expedited way with some of this technology that we're seeing out there. But still very early days, and I think that that has to be proven out still. So lots ahead.
Cool. And maybe we'll do the last question right here. It was the original last question, if that's okay.
Thank you so much for being here. I really like and agree with your perspective that sort of de-emphasizing the four-year degree and instead focusing on skills can be like a huge benefit to companies, for example. Do you have a point of view on how we can tease out and normalize a measurement of those skills, especially when some of those are like domain-specific skills that you can only learn in specific degrees? So as an example, I was a bio major, and it turns out that like thinking about molecular systems is not dissimilar from thinking about software systems, but finding my first job as a software engineer without the four-year degree was nearly impossible. So do you have a point of view on how we can sort of tease out those skill sets, especially when they can come from specific degrees?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if there was some economic incentive to doing this, like you could actually see a ton of innovation here. For example, what would be as a bio major, perhaps if you had some like series of simulations you could be in where you could prove out that you actually understood the material, that could be useful for learning. It could also be useful for assessment. But I think that actually there's probably like domain-specific answers for basically every domain you could think of, and that would probably be a lot better at helping people learn than tests and homework would be. But also would require a lot, and it's almost like a new field to get people to think that way and to develop that kind of material. So yeah, hopeful that we can find some way to incentivize that behavior.
Cool. Well, a huge thank you to all of you for coming, to Stripe for hosting, to Edwin, Tammy, and Claire for organizing, and of course to Dylan. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to meeting you all. Have a good night.
Oh, and people can stick around for until 8 or so, and then they'll boot you out. So please enjoy meeting each other, networking, recruiting, whatever it is you're going to do.